The year is 1327. The place, Berkeley Castle. It is a September night, thick and moonless. The air in the Gloucestershire countryside is heavy with the damp chill of approaching autumn and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. Inside the castle's keep, in a small, foul chamber far from the main halls, a man lies on a soiled pallet. He is thin, bruised, and shivering, but he was once a king. His name is Edward of Carnarvon, Edward II. The only sound is the scuttle of rats in the rushes and the distant, hollow sigh of the wind through the arrow slits. Then, a new sound. The slow, grating turn of an iron key in a massive lock. The man on the bed stirs, his eyes wide in the utter blackness. Heavy footsteps echo on the stone stairs, deliberate, unhurried. They stop outside his door. There is a whisper of metal on leather. A low, murmured instruction. The door crashes open. 5 years earlier, the same man stood at the height of his power, crowned, anointed by God, King of England. The court at Westminster was a riot of colour and noise, the clatter of gold plates, the sweet smell of spiced wine and roasting meats, the brilliant blues and reds of silks and tapestries. Edward II was a striking figure, tall, athletic, with a head of blonde curls. Yet even then, a tension hummed beneath the surface, a discord. His father, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was a hard, fearsome warrior king. His son was different. He found politics tedious, warfare a chore. His passions were simpler, more physical, thatching roofs, digging ditches, blacksmithing. And his affections were dangerously singular. Enter Piers Gaveston. A Gascon knight of charming wit and flashy prowess, Gaveston was the king's favourite. The bond between them was immediate, intense, and to the powerful barons of England, profoundly threatening. Edward heaped titles, wealth, and his own niece's hand upon Gaveston. The barons seethed. This was not how a king behaved. This was a betrayal of his class, his crown, his sacred duty. The smell of courtly perfume began to be undercut by the scent of treason. The king is like a lamb among wolves, one chronicler wrote. The wolves soon bared their teeth. Led by his own cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the barons rose. They forced Edward to exile Gaveston. But like a magnet, the king drew him back. The final rebellion was swift and brutal. In 1312, Gaveston was captured. On a bleak stretch of road, under a leaden sky, the barons ran him through with a sword. Then, as a final, grotesque insult, they beheaded him. The king's grief was a tempest. It curdled into a cold, silent fury that would shape the next decade. The lamb was gone. In its place was a resentful, grieving monarch, his heart now a fortress of vengeance. And into this emotional void stepped a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston was a spark, Despenser was a slow, insidious fire. Cunning, ambitious, and ruthless, he wrapped the king in a web of dependency and manipulation. Together, they grew rich, seizing lands and titles with a greed that made the barons' hatred of Gaveston seem like a petty squabble. The kingdom became a chessboard for their avarice. The air in the royal chambers grew thick with whispered schemes and the clink of counted gold. The Queen, Isabella, daughter of the fierce King Philip IV of France, watched this from a cold distance. Once a beautiful bride of 12, she had borne Edward 4 children, including the heir, young Prince Edward. But her husband's coldness, his public devotion to his favourites, was a constant, searing humiliation. She, the she-wolf of France, was left to pace the corridors of her neglect, a queen in title, a ghost in practice. The barons' fury finally exploded again. In 1321, they forced the king to exile the Despensers. But Edward had learned from Gaveston's fate. This time, he fought back. With a surprising military flair, he crushed the rebel armies. His cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, was captured. At Pontefract Castle, before a jeering crowd, the earl who had killed Gaveston was forced to kneel in the mud, facing France. The axe fell. The king's vengeance was complete. For a few brief years, Edward and Despenser ruled supreme. Their tyranny was absolute. They used torture, execution, and terror to hold the realm. But in their triumph, they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot about Isabella. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother. It was his greatest mistake. Freed from the oppressive atmosphere of her husband's court, the she-wolf shook off her chains. On the sun-drenched terraces of Paris, she found an ally, Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who had escaped from Edward's dungeons. Their alliance was political. It soon became passionately personal. Together, they began to plot. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer struck. With a small mercenary army, funded by her brother and the Pope, they landed on the Suffolk coast. The kingdom, sick of Edward and Despenser, did not rise to defend its king. It rose to join the Queen. London erupted in chaos. The city smelled of smoke and rebellion. Edward and Despenser fled west, like hunted animals, but there was no sanctuary. Despenser was caught first. His end was a public spectacle of horrific vengeance. At Hereford, before Isabella and Mortimer, he was dragged through the streets, then hanged from a gallows 50 feet high. He was cut down alive, his entrails drawn from his body and burned before his eyes. Only then was he beheaded. The message was clear: the old regime was dead. And the king. Edward was captured in a wild Welsh valley, abandoned by all, a pitiful figure. Parliament, under Isabella and Mortimer's control, was forced to perform a constitutional sacrilege. They did not charge the king. A king could not be charged. Instead, they declared him deposed. His son, a boy of 14, was proclaimed Edward III. The ceremony of accession was somber, haunted by the ghost of the king who still lived, which presented a terrible, pressing problem. For as long as the former king drew breath, he was a focal point for rebellion. A living king in a dungeon is a perpetual threat. He was moved from fortress to fortress, but whispers of rescue plots slithered through the kingdom like snakes, until he came to rest at Berkeley Castle, in the custody of Sir Thomas Berkeley and Sir John Maltravers, loyal men to Mortimer. The orders, though never written, were understood. The deposed king must not survive the winter. The stage was set. The actors were in place. And in that damp, dark cell, the footsteps outside his door heralded the final, terrible act of a tragedy 20 years in the making. The door yawns open, revealing not a guard with a tray, but shadows that hold a grim purpose. The man on the pallet, Edward, scrambles back, his chain scraping a desperate rhythm on the stone. He does not cry out for mercy. Perhaps he knows it is beyond offering. Two figures, their faces obscured by hoods, step into the meager light of a single tallow candle. They are large, their silhouettes blocking the world beyond. The smell of cold night air and sweat clings to them. With them comes a third man, smaller, holding an object wrapped in coarse cloth. The only sound is Edward's ragged breathing. This is the heart of the betrayal. The castle itself is complicit. Its owner, Thomas Berkeley, is conveniently absent, claiming later he knew nothing of what transpired under his own roof. The constable, John Maltravers, has retired to a distant part of the castle, his ears closed to the night's business. The walls of Berkeley, 10 feet thick in places, will swallow the sounds to come. The method is chosen not for cruelty's sake alone, but for a dark, practical reason. A king, even a deposed one, must show no marks of violence upon his body. His death must appear natural, an act of God or his own frail constitution. Sword wounds, bruises, a broken neck, these are the signatures of murder, and murder of a king is a dangerous precedent to set. It invites inquiry, retribution. So, they have brought the mattock. The cloth is unwrapped from a horn, a crude funnel. The smaller man moves with a terrifying, clinical detachment. The two hooded figures seize Edward. He fights, a final burst of frantic strength, a choked gasp escaping his lips. But malnutrition and despair have done their work. He is pinned, face down on the foul pallet. The stench of the unwashed rushes, of his own fear, fills his nostrils. The horn is inserted. Then, the red-hot poker, fetched from the smithy, its tip glowing like a malevolent star in the dark room. The sizzle as it meets flesh is a sound that does not echo. It is absorbed by the stone, by the body. There is a muffled, ungodly scream, a sound so internal it seems to shake the very air in the chamber. Then, silence, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. The deed is done. The killers withdraw, their work efficient, horrific, and designed to leave the royal corpse outwardly intact. They leave the king in his eternal darkness. The castle settles back into its nighttime murmurs, the wind resuming its lonely watch. Morning comes, grey and indifferent. The jailer, performing his grim duty, finds the body. The official story is prepared and released with swift efficiency. King Edward II, broken by his captivity and the loss of his crown, died of natural causes. A sudden illness. A failure of the heart. God's will. But the truth has a way of seeping through the cracks of even the best laid lies. The people of Berkeley Village, going about their daily routines, catch whispers on the air. Servants talk in hushed tones at the market well. A terrible cry was heard from the castle that night, they say. A cry that pierced the stoutest walls and travelled on the river mist. A cry that spoke of agony beyond human endurance. The story of the hot spit begins to circulate, a gruesome folktale taking root in the popular imagination. When the body is prepared for viewing, it is noted that the face, though peaceful in death, bears a strange, waxy pallor. The embalmers, men who have seen every manner of death, work in a peculiar silence. No official autopsy is performed, no examination ordered. The orders from Mortimer and Isabella are clear. Display the corpse, prove he is dead, and inter him with all due speed. The funeral at St. Peter's Abbey in Gloucester months later is a masterpiece of political theatre. The coffin is closed. A magnificent alabaster effigy lies atop it, depicting the king in his full regalia, crowned and sceptred, the image of sovereign power he had lost in life. Isabella and her son, the young Edward III, are present, figures of solemn piety. The air is thick with incense and hypocrisy. The she-wolf mourns the husband she destroyed. The son kneels before the father he replaced. For 4 years, Isabella and Roger Mortimer rule England. They are the de facto monarchs, lavish, arrogant, and increasingly hated. They believe they have buried the past along with the king in Gloucester. But the ghost of Edward II is not so easily laid to rest. It lingers in the resentful glances of the barons, who have traded one tyranny for another. It whispers in the ear of the growing king, Edward III, a constant reminder that his throne rests on the foundation of his father's murder. Young Edward is no puppet. He watches his mother and her lover wield power, seeing the corruption they spread. He remembers his father, not as the failed king, but as the man who held him as a child. A slow, cold fury builds within him. In 1330, the ghost demands its reckoning. A plot is hatched at Nottingham Castle, where the royal court is residing. Mortimer, paranoid, controls the fortress, even possessing the keys to the Queen Mother's apartments. But Edward III and his loyal companions use a secret passage, a dark, dripping tunnel that leads into the very heart of the castle. They emerge, swords drawn, to find Mortimer in conference with Isabella. The Queen Mother screams, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." Echo through the halls, but they fall on deaf ears. The son is now the king, and the king demands justice. Mortimer is dragged to the Tower. Parliament condemns him, not for the murder of Edward II, that charge is conspicuously absent from the official record, but for a host of other treasons. At Tyburn, before a silent, watching crowd, he meets the traitor's death, hanging, drawing, and quartering. His body parts are sent to decorate the gates of 4 cities. The message is as clear as the one he once sent with Hugh Despencer's entrails. The regime is over. Isabella is spared the axe. She is retired to Castle Rising in Norfolk, living out her days in comfortable, gilded confinement. For 30 more years, she lives with the memories, the guilt, the consequences of her rebellion. The she-wolf is caged. And Edward III, having avenged his father in the only way he politically could, begins a reign that would become one of England's most glorious. He raises a magnificent tomb at Gloucester, a shrine that pilgrims visit in great numbers. The murdered king becomes a saintly figure, a focus for sympathy. The very sight of his torment becomes a source of royal prestige and piety. But in the quiet of the night, in the dark corners of history, the questions persisted. The whispers never fully died. Did it truly happen as the chroniclers and the folk song said? The story of the red-hot poker is almost too perfectly grotesque, too symbolically apt, a fitting end for a king whose alleged vices were spoken of in hushed, horrified tones by his enemies. Could it be a later invention, a piece of political black propaganda against Mortimer and Isabella? Some modern historians have examined the sparse records and proposed a less sensational, but equally tragic, alternative. Perhaps Edward II did not die at Berkeley Castle in September 1327 at all. The funeral was undeniably rushed. The coffin remained closed. The rumors of a rescue plot were pervasive. What if the rescue succeeded? A fascinating, controversial letter discovered in the 19th century, known as the Fiesca letter, purports to be from a papal notary to Edward III, detailing a secret confession. In it, a man claiming to be Edward II states he was smuggled out of Berkeley Castle after the murder of a porter used as his double. That he fled, becoming a hermit, wandering Europe in penance, finally confessing his true identity on his deathbed in Italy. It is a wild story, full of holes, but it persists, a ghost of a possibility that the king escape his brutal fate. Yet, the weight of evidence, and the brutal political logic of the time, leans heavily toward murder. The Berkeley Castle account books, dry and administrative, tell their own chilling tale. In the days following the reported death, entries show payments for materials for making the chamber of the late king, and for a lock for the chamber in which the king was routine maintenance, or the sanitizing of a crime scene. More tellingly, Sir John Maltravers, one of the castle custodians, was later convicted in absentia for his role in the death. Thomas Berkeley was acquitted, claiming he was away at the time, a convenient, and perhaps prearranged, alibi. The debate is more than academic. It cuts to the heart of the story's enduring power. Was this a sordid, brutal killing, a literal internal violation? Or was it a more straightforward assassination, later embellished by poets and chroniclers to smear the regicides? The truth may lie somewhere in the grimy middle, a murder designed to be undetectable, using methods that would leave no mark, but whose horrifying specifics leaked out through the whispers of those who carried the coal, who heated the iron, who heard the cry in the night. Whatever the precise method, the outcome was certain. Edward II was eliminated. His murder was not a frenzied act of rage, but a cold, calculated piece of statecraft. It was a message written in blood and silence. Some threats are so profound they must be utterly, finally extinguished, even if it means piercing the very sanctity of anointed kingship. The fallout from that September night rippled through centuries. The immediate consequence was the short, sharp rule of Isabella and Mortimer, which collapsed under the weight of its own corruption and the rising will of Edward III. But the long-term consequences were etched into the DNA of English monarchy. Edward III's glorious reign, with its victories at Crecy and Poitiers, the founding of the Order of the Garter, the flourishing of chivalry, was built, ironically, on the grim foundation of his father's deposition and murder. He had learned a bitter lesson. A king must be strong, must lead in war, must manage his barons with a blend of favour and fear. He must never let a favourite, or even a queen, hold the reins of power so completely. The shadow of his father's weakness and his mother's ambition shape him into the archetypal medieval warrior king. For the institution of monarchy, the murder was a dangerous precedent. It showed that a king could be not only deposed, but killed, and killed not in battle, but in cold blood under a guise of legality. This spectre would return to haunt England during the Wars of the Roses and would reach its terrible climax with the very public beheading of Charles I in 1649. The seed of regicide, planted in the dungeons of Berkeley, bore bitter fruit. Berkeley Castle itself stands to this day, a brooding, magnificent presence. Visitors are shown the dank cell, the King's Gallery, and the deep pit where Edward was said to have been held. Guides speak in hushed tones of the haunting, of cold spots, of feeling an overwhelming sense of despair in the lower chambers. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the castle is undeniably a vessel for memory. Its stones seem to absorb the chill of that night, holding onto the echo of a tragedy that blurred the lines between politics and butchery. And what of the principal players? Their ends are a study in medieval justice and irony. Roger Mortimer died as he lived, in treachery and violence, though this time as its victim. His execution shattered Isabella's power and delivered Edward III into his own. Queen Isabella lived until 1358. From her luxurious confinement, she became a patron of the arts and religion, a generous benefactor to the very church that held her husband's tomb. Did she feel remorse? Her later piety suggests perhaps a troubled conscience. She requested burial in her wedding cloak, with the heart of Edward II placed on her breast. The request was denied. The final, poignant detail speaks volumes. She was buried with the alburial of Edward II's heart was a common medieval gesture of marital devotion, but the refusal hints at a permanent stain, a reconciliation even in death that her son would not permit. Edward III visited Gloucester Abbey frequently, lavishing gifts on the shrine of his father. He transformed it into one of the richest pilgrim sites in England. This was more than filial piety. It was political therapy. By honoring the murdered king, he was legitimizing his own rule, distancing himself from the regicides, and healing the rupture in the royal line. He turned his father's victimhood into a source of dynastic strength. The story of Edward II's murder endures because it is not just a historical true crime. It is a Shakespearean tapestry woven with threads of love, hatred, ambition, and betrayal. It features a flawed king, a vengeful queen, a ruthless lover, and a neglected son. It plays out in candlelit chambers, on bloody battlefields, and in the suffocating dark of a dungeon. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Where does loyalty end and treason begin? Can love for a person betray love for a country? How far is too far in the pursuit of power? The characters in this drama all believed their cause was just, their actions necessary. And in the end, they were all, in some way, destroyed by them. As the last lights of history fade on Berkeley Castle, one image remains, that of a man, alone in the dark, listening to the approaching footsteps of his own doomed destiny. His story is a warning whispered down the centuries, from the heart of a medieval night. It is the sound of a key turning in a lock, the sigh of a door opening, the final, terrible price of a crown.